So one thing about the ATAs, especially the GXW and the HT800 and 500, is that when you receive it for the first time, the web access to the device is disabled. So the first thing that you need to do is connect your ATA or gateway to your internet, then plug an analog phone to one of the FXS ports. Then you will need to use the voice menu from the phone. So basically I'm going to show you here some of those voice prompts. So the first time when you plug in the analog phone to the FXS port, the first thing you need to do is access the voice menu using the feature codes. So these are some of the menu features available through the voice prompt. So to access the voice prompt, you will need to dial star, 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 like triple star. Then it's going to prompt you to enter the feature code. Since we are interested in enabling the web access of the HT, we need to dial 12. So when you dial 12, the voice prompt is going to tell you whether the web interface is enabled or disabled. If it's disabled, you need to press 9 so you can enable it. Basically, 9 is used to toggle between enable and disable of the web interface. So when you enable the web interface or access to the web interface, you will need to reboot the gateway. And after you reboot the gateway, you're going to repeat the same process, but this time using a different feature code. So you're going to dial star, star, star 3 times, and then you're going to enter the feature code 02. So when you enter 02, the voice prompt is going to play your IP address that is configured on the gateway. Just take note of the IP address of the gateway, then just go to your browser and just type it in. For example, the IP address of my gateway is 162.168.2.1. This is from the LAN side. The voice prompt usually is going to provide you, or always is going to provide you, with the IP address of the WAN side. So I am connected to the LAN side of the GXW 4000. And by the way, the LAN side or the LAN interface of the GXW has a DHCP service enabled by default. So because my computer is connected to the LAN side, if you just run the IP config from your computer, you will see that my computer has been assigned an IP from the GXW, which is 192.168.100. So for login, by default, all the gateways, they come with admin as a password. So after you log into the web interface of the GXW, and again, I would like to repeat this, the GXW and the ATA family, they all share the same web interface and almost the same settings available on all of them. So the device that I'm using today is GXW 4008. So when you click on Status tab, it gives you status of your about your GXW. Since I'm using 4008, it shows the status of the FXS port from 1 to 8. All of them are unhooked and not registered, because this is just a brand new GWN. I haven't configured anything, and this is something that we're going to be doing through the webinar. So one of the other information that you can see from the status is the MAC address. As you will notice, the gateway has 2 MAC addresses because it has 2 Ethernet ports, one for WAN access and one for LAN access. So every time you try, for example, to do provisioning or to detect the device using one of those packet captures, the MAC address that you always need to look for is the LAN address. Even if you're connected from the WAN port, it's always the gateway is going to be broadcasting the MAC address of the LAN port. And you can see it here. It tells you the device MAC address. It also gives you information about the WAN IP. So the one IP of my gateway is 192.168.50.108. So this is the IP address that you're going to be receiving when you dial the feature code **02. It gives you information also about which device and the firmware version that is running on the gateway. Every time you ask to look for the firmware version, go and look for the program, because that's the one that represents the firmware version. So one that I'm running on my gateway is 1.0.15.5. It also gives you information about the uptime, whether the PPUE is enabled or disabled. It gives you information also about what type of NATing you're using. So the port options at the bottom, we already talked about the port status. The port options, it just gives you information whether DND is enabled. DND basically stands for Do Not Disturb, or if call forward is enabled, or busy forward, or delayed forward. Delayed forward is the same as unavailable. So when you forward calls when nobody is available to pick up the call. So through this webinar, we're going to be configuring things, then we're going to come back to the status to see how making changes to the gateway can change also the status. So the next tab is going to be the basic settings. From the basic settings, it provides you with these settings. That's where you configure the IP or DHCP or PPUE settings, the time zone. So from top to bottom, the setting, the top one, allows you to change the password for the user password, because we're talking about two passwords, the user password and the admin password. The admin password, you change it under advanced setting. So when a user basically logs into the gateway, they have access to a stripped down version of the gateway. So they're basically going to have access to the status and the basic settings. They're not going to have access to advanced settings and profile, and they would not be able to make any changes to the gateway. By default, the gateways, they come with port 80 for web access. You can change that port to a different port. Just make sure it's not conflicting with any other port that is being used in your network. Telnet also is being enabled by default. If you would like to block or disable access to Telnet, just check the no. By default, all the gateways, the ATAs, they come with the DHCP enabled. If you have, or if you would like to use a static IP, just check static, then configure the static IP. Make sure you include also the DNS server and the default gateway. Also, under the basic settings, you can change the time zone. It includes all the time zones. You can also include the self-defined time zone for your area. These are the codes. Basically, the 6 and the 5, they stand for daytime saving. So in case daytime saving is enabled, so these information right here, it just gives you information about like the day when daytime saving will take place. You can also choose the language. We have English, Chinese, and Spanish IVR. As I mentioned at the beginning, the LAN ports of the GXW, not all the ATAs, they have a DHCP enabled. Only the ATAs and the GXW, or the gateways that come with 2 Ethernet ports. The LAN side always comes with DHCP enabled. And always the IP address that comes by default for the gateway, or the IP address that you can use to access from the LAN side, is going to be 192.168.2.1. If you would like to disable the gateway and you don't want to use it as a router, you can just set it back to bridge. And what's going to happen, the LAN port is going to work as a switch port instead of a router port. And of course, the DHCP service will be disabled. These are a few settings that you can enable based on the LAN ports, like the bandwidth, the uplink, the downlink, and the TCP timeout. There are also some nice settings for security, like reply to ICMP on WAN port, in case you would like to, I'm talking about this setting right here, in case you would like to disable replying back to ping requests. You can just set that one to yes or no, depending on your requirements. By default, as I said, the WAN side HTTP access is disabled by default. So by using the feature code **12, then 9, we just enabled it from the voice prompt. You can come to the web interface, of course, and you can change it to no in case you would like to disable access to the web interface. If you have your own reason to block all the IPs and you have one specific IP that you use all the time, you can just include it under the whitelist for WAN side. So when you include the whitelist, what's going to happen, all the devices trying to access the gateway, they're going to be blocked except the IP address or the network address that you configure under the whitelist for WAN side. You can also include the black list for WAN side in case someone is trying to log in into your gateway and they are not authorized to have access to the gateway. You can just include their IP address so that the gateway will block them from accessing the web interface. This is one of the nicest features also in the gateway, especially GXW, is that you can clone the MAC address. You can change the MAC address of your gateway in case you don't like the other applications like a packet capture to detect that this is a Grandstream device. You can change the MAC address to any hexadecimal format. So we already mentioned this, and again, DHCP is enabled by default on the LAN side. If you would like to disable it, you can just click on no, then the DHCP service on the LAN side will be disabled. So these are the settings by default. 192.168.2.1, this is the IP used by the LAN port, and because it has a DHCP enabled, the range of IP addresses that the LAN port provides is from 100, which means 192.168.2.100, up to 192.168.2.199. Also the local subnet mask. And by the way, you can change this IP, you can change the range. You don't have to stick to 192.168.2 network. You can change it to class A network like 10.0.0, and then you can configure any IP that you would like. You also have the option to configure the lease time of the DHCP service. If you have the gateway also on the DMZ network, you just put the IP address of the DMZ. Since the gateway they support, especially GXW support, it works as a router, I mean, you can also configure port forwarding. So in case you have devices behind the LAN ports of the GXW, you can access those devices from the WAN side just by configuring the ports. Let's say, for example, I have another SIP device that is connected to the LAN port of the GXW, and I would like to access the web interface of that device. I can choose any port number, let's say 1245, and then the LAN IP, let's say is 192.168.2.103, and I would like to access the HTTP of that SIP device. I can just simply configure it that way, which means if I would like to access this SIP device behind the LAN port using port 80, what I need to type in if I would like to access that device is type in the WAN IP address, which is this one that we showed under the status, which is 192.168.50.108, and then I would just append the port number that I have configured, which means 192.168.50, that whatever number, colon, 1245. So every time you make any changes to the web interface of the gateway, it gives you two options. Update, which means you save the changes on the gateway, but they don't take effect until you press the apply. If you would like to cancel any changes, just click on cancel. The gateway also gives you the option to reboot from the web interface. So the next setting, the next tab actually that we're gonna go to is the advanced settings. This is where you do auto provisioning, authentication, and the VLAN configuration. So basically, when you go to advanced setting, the first thing that you have is admin password. You can change it by default. It's admin. You can change it to any password. The next one is the layer 2 QoS. Basically, we're talking about the 802.1q for the VLAN tagging. You can include, let's say this gateway is put on VLAN 20, you can just need to put VLAN 20. So this is manual assignment of the VLAN number. If you're using the 802.1p for class priority, you can just put the value, and we support value. The standard actually supports value from 0 to 7. If you have this gateway, for example, installed behind the NAT and you would like to use a stun server so that the gateway can always be accessible from outside, if you have a stun server, you just need to put the IP address or the domain name of the stun server that you will be using. And you can also configure and adjust the interval for the device to be sending those empty UDP packets to the stun server so that it knows where it is located. By default, the stun server is disabled. That's why you see it no. If you would like to use a stun server, make sure you check that one to yes. Talking about the firmware upgrade and provisioning, all our gateways, they support 3 types of provision. We support the TFTP, HTTP, or HTTPS. They all come with this default link, which is fm.grandstream.com/gs. This is the link for our global provision system. We call it GAPS. If you would like to use the Grandstream website for your upgrade, you can just type in firmware.grandstream.com. This is the link that we use for upgrading our devices from the Grandstream website. And of course, you need to set it up to HTTP. In case you are using your own TFTP server and HTTPS, just choose which one you're going to be using. The configuration, server path, that depends where you have your config file stored. Our Grandstream devices, we use the XML format for our configurations. And when you basically create a config file for any Grandstream device, the gateway or an ATA, they're always going to be looking for the firmware, the config file that has the name of CFG plus the MAC address of the gateway or the ATA.xml. You can also make your configuration or pushing the configuration to the gateway more secure by configuring an XML config file password. This password that you put in there, you have to use OpenSSL. If you have a Linux machine, you can just use the same key or the password, and then you can encrypt the whole config file using OpenSSL from a Linux machine or Unix machine. And that password that you're going to be using, that's the one that you're going to put in here. Then you can take the encrypted file and put it on your HTTP or HTTPS server. In case you would like also to add more security, the UCM, this is for we're talking about provisioning, you can also include the username and password for the config file. So in case you are using HTTP and you would like to the gateway to grab the config file from the HTTP server, you can challenge the gateway to make sure that the request is coming from the gateway or the legitimate gateway. You can assign it a username and a password that you have configured on your HTTP or HTTPS server.
Two quick questions just on that topic that just came in before we move on. Gerald's asking, if you host your own firmware server, can you set the firmware provisioning to a private server and not the Grandstream server?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it gives you the option. If you have your own HTTP server, you just need to log into firmware.grandstream.com. Then it's going to give you all the firmware files for different devices. Then go and choose the one for your own device, download it, unzip it to get the bin file, because what matters is the bin file. Then you can put it in your TFTP or HTTP or HTTPS server, depending on what you're using. So you don't need to stick to the Grandstream. This is only for people who don't have their own TFTP or HTTP server.
And then last question before you move on. Bill's asking if you can extract the configuration from our HTs as an XML file.
Yeah, there's an option here at the bottom. Let me scroll down. All the way at the bottom, if you go down here, let's say you have an ATA and you're using that ATA as a template. Yeah, you just configure this ATA or the gateway. Then you can just go down here and then click on download either XML file or TXT file. If you download XML file, then you can just go and upload it to any other device, any gateway, just by going down here, upload from local directory. Just put the XML file in your own desktop or storage device, then just upload it from there.
Cool, thanks.
This is also a nice feature in case you are using the same, in case you have like multiple thousands of devices and you have different clients and different requirements from different people. You can put all the config files in one path, and you can configure all the gateways with one path, but you can change the firmware file prefix. Let's say you have multiple firmware files on the same link. You can differentiate between them just by adding a prefix or a postfix to the file name, so you can differentiate between them. But the name, any prefix, let's say you add 1245 to the firmware file. The firmware file on your link, let's say HTTP or TFTP, it needs to have, the file needs to be also prefixed with 1245. These are other settings related. These are other settings related to provisioning. You can you can configure this link right here manually, the config server path, or you can push it, the config server path, through option 60 or option 160 to override the config server that we have configured manually. If you have, for example, your own DHCP server, instead of logging to the to the GXW or the ATA and make the changes manually, you can just go to your DHCP server and configure option 66 or 160 with the config server path. So when the gateway reboots, it's going to request the DHCP server for the option 66. 3CX auto provisioning, this is also useful. This option, basically what it does, when the gateway starts, it's going to send subscribe message to a multicast address requesting the config file. If you are using, for example, this gateway with the UCM, you can also use the zero config from the UCM. And if you have config file for that device in the zero config, once this device reboots, it's going to send a subscribe to the multicast. Once the UCM sees that there is a multicast for asking for the config file, it's just going to provision the config file to the gateway. This setting, actually, it works with 3CX, it works with other third-party IP PBXs. You can also set automatic upgrade to yes, and you can set up the time. Let's say I want this gateway to check the firmware upgrade every week. Just check yes, and then convert the days into minutes and then put the value in there. You can also, it gives you the option when the gateway or the ATA reboots, you can configure it every time the gateway or the ATA reboot to request a new firmware. And what it does, it's going to request the firmware server path that you have configured and check if there is a new firmware. Once it checks that there is a new firmware, it's going to start requesting the firmware file. If the firmware file has the same size, then it's just going to ignore the upgrade and then continue to complete the reboot. These are some options related to the SIP Notify authentication. This is basically so when the IP PBX or the SIP carrier, they send a notify to the gateway, you can configure it to challenge the notify to make sure that it's coming from the legitimate IP PBX or SIP server. But you just have to be careful before you enable that one. Make sure that your IP PBX or SIP carrier, they accept being challenged for the SIP notify. You can also configure authenticate config file by checking this one to yes. This is in case you're using secure SIP over TLS. You can just copy the key certificate and the private key and also the secret or the key password for more security. The settings at the bottom are related to the auto configuration server in case you have one or you are using one. And the auto configuration service is just another service that allows you, it's basically used a lot by ITSPs when they have thousands of devices. It just makes managing those devices easier just by making changes and provisioning those changes to the phone. These settings, the URL, username, and password, and the certificate and the private key, these settings, they all need to be provided by the ACS. So the next setting right here is about the ring tones on the GXW. These are the default ones. These are applied to the US. If you would like to change them, you can also change them. This is the ring cadence 2000, 4000, which means it gives you information here at the bottom if you look at the syntax. Like this one here, it's going to ring for that time, then it's going to go off for twice the time that it rings. You can change these values, up to you. If you would like to leave them that way, they work fine because that's what we use in the US anyway. Since I'm using the GXW 4000, the 4000, they come with some LEDs. You can change the pattern if you don't like the pattern that we have right now. It gives you three options, whether you would like it to be off, on hook, or reversal, which means when it's off hook, it's going to turn off. This is up to you. These are personal choices. You can also, as I mentioned at the beginning, you can make changes to the configuration of the gateway through the voice prompt. If you would like to block this capability for end users, just set that one to yes. You can also disable the voice prompt so that people, when they dial ***, they're not going to be prompted to enter options for the menu. If someone is bothering you with those IP calls, these are especially used when people are scanning your network. And one of the symptoms of direct IP calls is ghost calls, or what they call phantom calls. The phone is just going to ring, you pick up the phone, there's nobody there, and that thing is going to be happening and repeating like multiple times. If you have that issue, just come here and disable the direct IP call. If you are using IP call, make sure it's enabled and it is set to no by default. The Lifeline mode, this is a nice feature. It's a good feature. Since I'm using the GXW, all of them, they come with one extra port, and it's marked with line. That port is used to connect your gateway to the CO side, which means the analog line that is coming from your carrier. And Lifeline capability, what it does when there is a power outage or when the phone loses, the gateway loses registration, you will still be able to use the PSTN line and make calls instead, in case you have, for example, or calling 911 is a requirement for your business. You can just connect one of the PSTN lines to the line port in the back of the GXW. You can set it to auto, or you can always disconnect that one, which means disable it, or always connected, which means the FXS port 1 and the line, they have this Lifeline capability. So if you want, for example, to use FXS 1 for an analog phone only for emergency calls to 911, you can just set it to always connected. And if you set that one to always connected, that means FXS port 1 is not going to be able to use the SIP registration on the gateway. This is another option for failover in case you are using the GXW with an FXS gateway. You can configure it as a failover. In case, for example, your SIP registration fails and the gateway is not able to register to the SIP carrier, you just need to have another FXO gateway and create peer-to-peer connection with the FXO gateway. Let's say the IP address of the gateway, FXO gateway, is 50.41. Just put the address of the FXO gateway. There's also one requirement about this one. So when you configure the FXO gateway on the GXW, you need to make the same configuration on the FXO gateway so that the peer-to-peer connection completes. This is where you configure the NTP server and the interval for requesting time and date. A syslog server, because our gateways, they don't have a built-in Ethernet capture or an IP capture. In case you have issues or problems with the gateway, it's always better to use the syslog because it provides deep information about the gateway, hardware information, also SIP information. When you have the SIP log enabled, always make sure to check debug because we are interested in capturing all the information generated by the gateway. If you don't have a syslog server, you don't have to get one. You can just simply go to your to Wireshark and then install it on your computer, and then point the gateway to send all the syslog messages to your laptop where the Wireshark is running. So you're just going to have to go to Wireshark, start the Wireshark, and then replicate whatever issue you have on the gateway. And by the way, every time you configure the syslog, make sure you apply changes, and after you apply changes, reboot the device, because syslog does not take effect only after rebooting the device. And of course, when you have a syslog and you would like to send syslog to Grandstream support to troubleshoot your issue, always make sure that the send SIP log is enabled, because we are also interested in capturing the SIP logs. This is also one of the nicest features, like you can use the gateway with the Radius server, and it gives you option to configure 2 Radius servers, the primary one and the secondary one. The Radius server, basically what it does, it does authentication, authorization, and accounting for billing purposes. So when someone tries to make a call from the gateway and you have the Radius server service configured, they're going to be challenged to enter the secret word before they can complete the call. This is a nice feature for adding more security to your gateway. So we already talked about this one, how to download device configuration. The top one is if you would like to download the TXT file. If you want to use the XML file, just click on download. You can actually download the config file in case one of your devices becomes faulty, you can just download the config file of that device and then upload it to another device without having to go back to go to that device and configuring it from scratch. If you have your bin file, the firmware file on the gateway, you can just do a manual upgrade. Just download it from the Grandstream website, then unzip the file, and when you get the bin file, you can just upload it manually to the UCM in case you don't have a TFTP, HTTP, or an HTTPS server. So moving to the next tab, which is the profile. As you can see, the GXW 4000 gives you the option to configure 2 profiles in case you are using 2 accounts from 2 different SIP carriers, or in case you have 2 accounts with different settings. Let's say you have one for audio and another one for fax. You can configure 2, one for fax and one for phone calls. So under Profile tab, this is basically where you do all the SIP settings. This is where you change the SIP packet. This is where you include different header fields in the SIP packet. This is where you change your SIP registration settings. Most of those changes are done under Profile. So when you get in touch with your SIP carrier and then you buy an account with them and they provide you with the SIP settings, usually there are like 5 or 4 items that they provide for you, and they ask you to configure them on the gateway. The top one, of course, they're going to provide you with the IP address or the domain name of their SIP server. Let's say I'm using my IPPBX in my environment. So I have this IP address. In case they support a failover SIP server, you can also include that one. It gives you the option to prefer primary SIP server. So when the primary SIP server goes down, the gateway is going to be sending SIP register for like 3 times. If there is no response, it's going to switch automatically to the failover SIP server. And if you have that one checked, which means when it registers to the failover SIP server, after the registration expires, it's not going to send the SIP register to the failover SIP server, but it's going to send it to the primary SIP server. It's going to always go back and try to register to the primary SIP server. Outbound proxy, that depends whether your carrier or your IPPBX or your network supports outbound proxy. If you support it, you can just enter the domain name or the IP address. The SIP transport, we support 3 modes. We support the UDP, which comes as the default, in case you would like to use TCP or TLS. So we have 3 of them. The NAT traversal by default is set to no. I strongly recommend, if you have this gateway configured to a SIP carrier and it's behind NAT, to choose Keep Alive. If Keep Alive doesn't work, then you can move on to Stun, and you can configure the Stun server as I showed you already under the basic settings. So in case you are using domain name instead of IP address for the primary SIP server, that depends on your carrier. If they're using just one domain name resolved with one IP address, you can just leave it as a record. In case they're using failover with SRV, you can choose SRV record or NAPTR SRV record. In case you're using, for example, a domain name and you would like to use specific IP addresses for that domain name, let's say that domain name resolves to 3 IP addresses, you can just click on Use Configured IP, then you can include the IP addresses that are resolved to the same domain name of the primary SIP server. These settings usually depend on the requirements of your IPPBX or your SIP carrier. If they don't require making those changes, you can leave the same settings as default and just configure the SIP settings like the primary SIP server, SIP user ID, authenticate ID, and the password or the outbound proxy if provided. So this setting right here, use request routing ID in SIP invite header, because if you are familiar with the SIP protocol, whatever SIP user ID you're going to be using, that's the value that's going to be put in the from header field in the SIP path. In case you are using, for example, you have a SIP account and then you have 4 DIDs with that same SIP account, you can configure each port, and we're gonna talk about this when we reach the FXS port. But I'll just mention it quickly here. In case you have 4 ports, you have 1 SIP account, and then you have 4 DIDs, and you are using them for 4 ports, you can actually enter those DIDs in under request URI routing group. Let's say the first one is using 566.9300. The second one is using 9322. So when you configure these settings right here, that's what, and you have that setting right here set to yes. The gateway is going to include the DID that you configured under the FXS port instead of sending the SIP user ID. The next one is SIP registration. Of course, if you are using SIP registration, you have to set that one to yes. In case you are using this gateway, like in a peer-to-peer connection, in case you would like, for example, to peer this gateway to another FXO gateway for the purpose of extending analog lines over IP, you just need simply to disable SIP registration because you are creating a peer-to-peer connection. The next option is unregister on reboot. So the phone, before it reboots, it's going to unregister the account so that when it reboots again, it's going to send a new SIP registration. If you have that one set to yes, every time the gateway renew the lease for the DHCP, the IP provided by the DHCP server, the gateway is just going to remove registration, then re-register again. So in case you are seeing in your SIP server that the gateway is being sent in like removing registration and then re-register again, this could be the setting that you need to change by setting it back to no. Outgoing call without registration. By default, it's set to yes. This is useful if you have a peer-to-peer connection, let's say with another IP device. It's always better to have it set to yes. The bottom one is register expiration. You can change this value. It comes by default with 60 minutes, which means when the gateway registers with the SIP server after 60 minutes, it's going to send another SIP registration to renew the SIP registration. Re-register before expiration, you can specify also this value. SIP registration failure, retry, wait time. By default is 20 seconds. This is the scenario where this setting applies. Sometimes, because of network issues, the gateway might be sending SIP register to the SIP server, but there is no response. So when the gateway sends a SIP registration, there is no response, it's going to wait 20 seconds, then it's going to send another one. And this is how it goes. It's going to keep sending it every 20 seconds. The next one is SIP registration failure. Let's say the gateway is trying to register to a SIP server, then the SIP server rejecting registration for some reason. The gateway will send another SIP registration based on the time that you configured in this box. These are the bottom for differentiated service. This is layer 3 QoS. By default, it's 26 and 46 in case you're using the LAN ports of the GXW. Next one is the local SIP ports. By default, for profile 1, it's 5060, and for the RTP traffic, we use the local port 5004. If you only have one SIP device in your local area network, it's okay. You can just leave them the way they are, the default settings. But if you have multiple devices that are all using the same default SIP port 5060, I would suggest to use a random port instead of using the configured. So when you set that one to random ports, what's going to happen? The gateway, every time there is a new call dialog, it's going to use a different SIP port and a different RTP port instead of those configured right here. The hold target before refer, this is enabled by default. This is useful. I mean, if you set it to no, you're not going to be able to have the capability to do attended transfer. So always leave that one to yes if you would like to use attended transfer with the gateway. I mean, basically what it does, if someone calls you and then you want to do an attended transfer, you just press the flash hook on the phone, then it gives you dial tone, then you can dial. It's going to put the first call on hold, then you can dial, make the second call. But if you don't like to use attended transfer, you can just set that one to no. Refer to use target contact. This is useful for blind transfer. And what it does, when someone calls your phone and then you transfer the call, if you have that one set to no, the transfer target is not going to see the original caller ID, which means the person that initiated the call in the first place. But instead, it's going to see the caller ID of the person or the phone that initiated the transfer. So in case you would like to keep the caller ID of the original caller, just set that one to yes. So when the transferer transfers the call to the transfer target, it's going to show the caller ID of the transferee, which means the person that initiated the call in the first place. Transfer on conference hang-up. This feature is useful because you can use our gateways. They support three-way conference call. So when you initiate a conference call from your gateway, you have two options. If it's set to no, that means if you guys, three of you talking on the phone and the one connected to the GXW hang up the phone, the whole conference call will be disconnected. Sometimes you like to make a conference call, but you want to get out of the conference, but you want to leave the other two parties still talking to each other. If that's the case, make sure you set that one to yes, which means even if you hang up the call, the other two parties will still remain connected to the call. This is for the Bellcore style three-way conference. You can set that one to yes. There are some local features on the gateway that you can use, and I have some of them here. We can go through some of them, the main ones, quickly. So this is in case you would like to enable SRTP. SRTP basically is secure RTP. And what it does, by default, the gateways, they use RTP. If you run like a packet capture, you will be able to play the audio. But if you want to encrypt your audio for some calls that are important and confidential to you, and you are worried about those calls being recorded, you can just dial *16 and then the number that you would like to call. Then the whole audio conversation is going to be encrypted. These are multiple feature codes. If you go to the user manual of the ATA or the gateway, you will find them there with the same explanation. Another one that could be useful to you is the *47, this one right here. This one enables you in case you don't have, you have SIP devices in your network, but you don't have an IP PBX to route calls. You can simply make IP calls just by dialing *47 and then the IP address of the SIP device. The analog phones, of course, they don't support the dot that's in the IP address. If that's the case, you need to use the *. Let's say I want to make an IP call to 10.10.10.10. I will need to dial star 47 010 star 010 star 010 star. So you have to include the leading zeros. For example, if you have an IP that starts with 10, you need to include 010 because you need to include at least 12 digits in the IP. You can also disable call waiting, which means if you dial star 50, you will enable or disable, star 51, you will enable or disable call waiting for the whole calls. If you would like to disable call waiting for a specific call, you can just dial star 70 and then make your call. You can also enable unconditional call forwarding with star 72 and disable it with star 73. You can also enable DND with star 78, star 79. You can initiate a blind transfer with star 87. These features, as I said, you can find them in the user manual of your ATA or gateway. So going back to the web interface of the GXW, so we mentioned that the gateway supports the Belcore three-way conference. If you set that one to yes. The next feature is remove outbound proxy from route header. This is basically changes the SIP or the route header field in the SIP packet. And the difference this feature does, it enables either you want to be using strict routing or loose routing. So if you set it to yes, you're basically enabling strict routing. If you set it to no, you are using loose routing. Support SIP instance ID. That depends on your SIP server or SIP carrier. By default, it's enabled. If your carrier tells you that we don't like to have the SIP instance ID attached to the contact header field, just come back here and set it to no. These are also another layer of security for the SIP traffic. There are multiple options here: validate incoming SIP message, check SIP user ID for incoming invite. This is useful in case you are receiving those ghost calls or phantom calls. I always recommend two settings to enable. Make sure you disable. Make sure this one is set to yes, and the allow incoming SIP messages from SIP proxy only. These two needs to be set to yes in case you have that issue with ghost or phantom calls. Authenticate incoming invite. This is also provides another security layer, but the problem with this setting, before you enable that one, you need to check with your SIP server or your SIP carrier that they accept to be challenged when they send an invite. Most carriers that I worked with, when you challenge them for authentication, they're just going to reject the call automatically. So before you enable or disable this one, check with your SIP server admin. The two other settings, these are for, before you enable those, by default it's set to default, which means if your SIP carrier, they support the PEI or the PPI, you can just set it to yes or no. If your carrier, they say, we don't want you to send us the PEI or the PPI, just come here and set them to no. Again, these settings, they depend on the requirements of your SIP carrier, so you don't need to go there and start making changes by yourself. You need to check with your SIP carrier before you make any changes to the SIP headers in the SIP packet. These are the settings for the DTMF. We support the three methods. We support the RFC 2833. This is an out-of-band DTMF. It is sent as an RTP event. We support also DTMF through the SIP info or in audio. Three of them, depending on your IP PBX or SIP carrier, you can choose which one you would like to use. The DTMF payload, by default, it's 101. I think it's on all Grandstream devices we use 101. In case you are using this gateway with, let's say, a door system, and you have it used with a third-party IP PBX, one of the issues if this value doesn't match is people, when they call from the gateway and then you press a digit, it doesn't lock the gateway. If that's the case, make sure this payload matches what you have on your IP PBX. If you're using the UCM, that's not going to be an issue because we're using the same payload value. So the setting right here at the bottom, disable DTMF negotiation. In case you always would like to use specific DTMF, just set that one to yes, which means the other party that you're going to be talking to, you're going to tell them, I would like and I want you to use that DTMF like RSC or RTP event. Enable call features, the features that we just talked about, the star 47, star 87. If you don't like to use the local feature codes of the gateway and you would like to use the feature codes of your IP PBX or your SIP carrier, you can just change it to no. Then the local ones, they're not going to apply, but your IP PBX feature codes are the ones that are going to be applied. This is one of the nicest features. Also, you can configure the off-hook auto dial delay. When we go to the FXS ports, you will see that we have a feature where you can configure auto dial auto dial from the phones, which means once they pick up the phone, after whatever value you configure, let's say I put 10, that means after 10, if I don't dial any digits, the gateway is going to dial whatever number I have configured under the FXS port. And we're going to talk about that when we reach the FXS port tab. Use the NAT IP. Sometimes when you have the gateway behind the NAT and your firewall or your router has a static public IP address, you can include that one in that box. So that when the gateway sends the SIP packet to your IP PBX or your SIP carrier, they're always going to include the public IP address of your router because in the SIP packet, the gateway or any SIP device, it doesn't matter whether it's a gateway or an IP phone, they're always going to include whatever you have configured as an IP, which is the local IP. You can change the name of the SIP user agent header that's in the SIP packet. So when you capture the SIP packet, it shows what device this SIP package was sent from. If you would like to change it to hide the model that you are using, you can put any value. You can just put Jane Doe or any value that you want. It doesn't matter. And that's what the gateway is going to be sending. Distinctive ring tone. This makes changes. It doesn't provide you with a different ringtone, but basically it's just going to change the ring cadence of the ringtone. Let's say someone is like I have a business partner and they call from this number all the time. So every time I want them, when they call from their number, I want my phone to ring a different ringtone. I can choose from 1 to 10. Let's say I want to give them ringtone 9. You can configure up to 3 numbers with distinctive ringtones. The next features are for the call features. These are for call waiting, caller ID. In case you are using, for example, this gateway for this profile only for sending faxes, just make sure you set that one to yes. Because fax and caller ID might, especially with the call waiting tone, might disrupt the fax tone. So just make sure you set that one to no. So once you, of course, you disable the call waiting, these two, they're going to be disabled by default. This is a nice feature. Sometimes when you put someone on hold, then you make a second call, you might forget that there's somebody else on hold. If you set that one to yes, and then you finish with your second call and you still have someone else on hold, just once you hang up the phone is going to ring to remind you that there is someone else on hold. You just need to check that one to no. do not put it to yes. By default, it's set to no, so you should be good if you have it set to the default setting. Disable visual MWI. The MWI stands for the message waiting indicator. This is useful. Some phones, they have that capability in case you have those MWI LEDs. So when there's a voicemail, the gateway is going to send a notify message. The IPPBX is going to send a notify message to the gateway. Then the gateway is going to send a signal to the phone to turn on the MWI LED. We support two MWI methods. We support the FSK and the Neon. It depends on your phone model that you're using. Just make sure you choose the right one. This is another setting. By default, on all the phones, the analog phones that you connect to the gateway, so when you press the pound key works as redial or dial, like send. If you would like to use that one for a different value, because some of the IPPBXs, they actually use the pound in their feature codes. If that's the case, you can just set that one to yes instead of no. This is where you configure timeout. By default, it's 60 seconds. That means if you call an extension on the gateway, it's going to ring for 60 seconds. If nobody picks up, that depends. The call might give you a busy tone, or it's going to take you to the voicemail. The hunt group, the gateway, some gateways, I mean all gateways and some ATAs, they support hunt group, like GXW 4004, 4008, and HT 814 and HT 704. They all support hunt group. You can choose the ring timeout for the hunt group, which means if you have it set up as linear, that means it's going to ring the first port for 20 seconds. If they don't pick up, it's going to move on to the second port for 20 seconds, and then the third port for the 20 seconds. It gives you two options that you can configure the hunting group, either circular or linear. Circular is like a round robin. If it rings the first time, port 1, the second call is going to ring on port 2, then the third one is going to ring on port 3. If you set it to linear, that means all the calls, all the time, they're going to start with port 1. Unless that port is busy, that's when it's going to go to port 2. You can also configure the dial plan. Yeah, that's important, the dial plan. By default, these are the ones that come with default. In case you have your own dial plan, you can just add them. If you go to the user manual, it's going to give you the syntax of the dial plan that you need to use with the gateway. I'm just going to give you one example here. In case your users, so you install the gateway and they make local calls, but they were used to dialing only the 7 digits instead of 10 digits, and you're a SIP carrier, they require 10 digits. So to keep it convenient for users, instead of telling them dial 10 digits, you can also include a dial plan. This is just an example. Let's say you call into Boston. So when you configure, for example, this is just an example of how you can play with the dial plan. If you put 7 X's, you're telling the gateway every time anyone dials 7 digits, an X stands for digits. So every time they dial 7 digits, you tell the gateway prepend 617. So the gateway actually is going to receive 7 digits, prepend 617. It's going to send it as a 10-digit number. This is one of the settings which I recommend to enable in case you are using fax machine with the gateway. Just make sure you set that one to yes. And this feature, what it does, when someone is calling your gateway and it's sending a fax, when the gateway detects that there is a fax tone, that's when it's going to start sending a second invite to initiate T38 fax session. And I'm not sure if you went through that one. Yeah, it's right there at the bottom. So we're going to be talking about it later. So in case you are using this one for fax, make sure you set that one to yes. And this one also needs to be enabled, set to yes. This setting right here enables silence detection for fax disconnect. Some fax machines, when they receive a fax, they don't send the disconnect signal. So they just go silent. So when you set that one to yes, the gateway is going to be listening. So when it detects there is a silence for more than 7 seconds, it's just going to disconnect the call. Enable 100 REL. So this one is for, we call it provisional. So in case you send 180 for ringing, you like to receive acknowledgement. It actually stands for reliable provisional codes. You don't have to set that one. This is only a requirement if your SIP server or your SIP carrier or your IPPBX requires that one, or you need it for a certain reason. You can just set it to yes. Add the authentication header on initial register. The way registration or SIP registration works with SIP devices, depending on your SIP server, is that the endpoint, let's say gateway, sends a SIP register to the SIP server, then the SIP server would challenge the gateway for authentication, then the gateway would send another SIP register with authentication before they get the two-handed OK. If you would like to avoid like 4 messages instead of 2, you can just set that one to yes, so that the gateway, when it first tries to register, it's going to include its own authentication. These are the codecs supported on the gateway: PCMU, PCMA, G723, G729. If you would like to use, for example, 729, you can just set that one to 729 as the top one. So when you have that one set to no, this feature, use first matching vocoder. If you're, the other party that you're going to be talking to, if they don't support the codec and choice 1, they're going to be negotiating. So until they reach an agreement, if you always want to implement choice 1, which means you want G729 or G711 PCMU, and you want always to be using choice 1, you can set that one to yes, which is always the choice 1 that's going to apply. These are only payload settings for the codecs. You can also use the VAD. This is called the voice activation detection, which means if you set that one to yes and if there is a silence, the gateway is not going to be sending those RTP packets. So it's just going to, this is good to save your bandwidth in case no one is talking on the phone. You have also the option to enable symmetric RTP. This is the one that we talked about, the fax. If your carrier or your SIP server supports T38, you can use T38. It's more reliable. But if your carrier do not support T38, make sure you use pass-through instead. Fax tone detection, you can choose which side you would like to detect the fax detection. You can also enable the jitter buffer to be fixed or adaptive. You can also set the jitter buffer, the length to low, medium, or high. The SRTP, this is encryption for audio. You can disable it if you just want to use the plain RTP. If encryption is very important for your phone calls or your audio calls, you can just set it to enabled and forced. Make sure always, if you want to use SRTP, to have that one, the crypto lifetime, set to enabled. The next settings, they basically related to the caller ID and the FXS termination or the disconnect signaling. Just make sure you select your country. By default, it comes with the USA. The caller ID scheme by default is Bellcore. You can also choose the other schemes for other countries. The three ones at the bottom here, these three settings, they're related to the disconnect signal. That depends on the remote device. You have two options: polarity reversal, loop current disconnect, and play busy reorder tone for loop current disconnect. Sometimes if you're using this gateway with a paging system, sometimes you call the paging system, then you hang up the call, then you have like 3 or 5 seconds playing busy tone after that. If that's an issue for you and you would like to disable that busy tone after you hang up the call, you can just play with you can toggle the loop current disconnect to yes or no. You can also set the loop current disconnect threshold. By default, it comes with 200. You can increase it, decrease it, depending on the requirements of the connected device. Also, if you have the fax machine connected to the gateway, make sure you set that one to yes, because you would like to disable the line echo canceller. These are the default ringtones on the phones. This is the cadence, and you can change that cadence to any any preferences that you have. So the last one is going to be the FXS port. This is actually, so when you configure the primary SIP server under profile, this is where you come and you include your SIP user ID and authenticate ID and the password. These are usually provided by your SIP carrier or your IP PBX. You can assign any name, and you can choose profile, which profile you have configured for the port 1. In case you are using a hand group, let's say I have only one. Let me try something here. Okay, so we can take this as an example. Let's say I have port 1 configured with one SIP account, and I'm using user ID 1018. I can assign each port its own SIP user ID, or in case I have only one account and I want to use them for the other ports, I can set the main one that is registered as active. And if I want to use 2 and 3 to be part of the same hunt group, I just need to choose the number of the ports. So when I select 1, I'm telling FXS port 2 to be part of the hunt group of port 1. I can also include the third FXS 3. And one recommendation, I always recommend do not go beyond 3 members of the hunt group. Some people, they might include 8. You might get some problems with that. Always stick to 3 members in a hunt group. And we already talked about this one in case you would like to send different DIDs or caller IDs from each port. You can just configure them in this setting. So every time, if you have that one configured this way, every time there's a call coming for that number 617-566-9350, it's going to ring port 3. And every time port 3, and if you have the setting that I showed you under profile 1 enabled, it's always going to be showing this as the original caller ID when they make outbound call. Of course, make sure when you make those changes, make sure that the port is enabled by checking that it's set to yes. The ones at the bottom here, this is where you configure the off-hook auto dial. So when they pick up the phone, you can configure it to dial specific number. Let's say you have one phone connected to port 8, And every time, this is only for emergency, every time they pick up the call, they pick up the handset is going to dial 911. The settings next to it, these are in case you are using GXW 4000 with another FXO port. That's where you configure the line and then the IP address of the FXO gateway and then the port of the FXO gateway. So when you make those configuration here on the GXW, make sure that you make the same configuration on the other FXO gateway. I think we have covered all the settings and all the features available on the GXW. If you guys have any more questions, please feel free to ask them and we will answer them.
Awesome. Excuse me. Thanks, Abdel. Good stuff. I have maybe a couple of questions, maybe only, that we didn't get to. But just want to point out that this was pretty much specifically on our FXO, or excuse me, FXS gateways. There you go, and the ATAs, yeah, today. And obviously, I think you mentioned this earlier on that the user interface you were using here from the from the 4000 series is almost identical to the ATAs.
Yes.
Cool. All right. Covered a lot of stuff. Let's see if there's anything that we didn't get to in the questions. David actually just sent in, what is the difference between using the FXS port on a UCM and using a gateway?
Actually, there is no difference. It's just the gateways. You can actually, they have a lot of settings that you can play with, that you can set them to your UCM. The UCM also, the FXS ports on the UCM also has its own advantage because it supports, especially for fax, if you're using for fax, it supports both modes, RTP or UDP-TL. In case your carrier is using UDP-TL, you can actually configure it on the UCM. The UCM doesn't have some options like the gateway. The gateway was designed actually for that purpose, for the analog phones and the analog faxes. But you can always, I mean, the UCM still works fine. Similar, except in few cases that depends on which fax machine you have connected to the FXS port.
Cool. Bernard is wondering if you know if the fax feature on these devices will work with Microsoft Exchange 2003.
That one, honestly, we haven't tested.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah, we haven't.
It's an old, sounds like older software.
Yeah.
So, do you know about Exchange in general? If it'll be, with Exchange in general, you're saying we haven't probably.
The Exchange server?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it should.
Okay.
It should work. Yeah, because I have few customers using it with the Exchange server, and it works for them fine.
Back from a while ago, somebody was asking if you need the prefix needs a dot between the prefix and the name for the file name. Trying to remember what that was in relation to.
Probably we're talking about the firmware file.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. So this is
Yes,
how
you're right.
how it works. I mean, you have two options here: prefix for the firmware file and prefix for the config file. The gateway, let's say we have the GXW 4000. So when it's going to request for the firmware file, it's going to request for the file GXW 4004 fw.bin. So when you include the prefix, the file name is going to change. Let's say I put 22. So the file name is going to change to 22GXW 4004 fw.bin. If you're using the postfix and I'm using 33, the file name is going to change to GXW 4004 fw.bin33. So the postfix is going to be appended to the extension, to the bin extension. And you can do the same thing with the config file.
Cool.
So there's no dot, going back to your question.
What do we got here? Anything left? Elliot is asking about automatic ring down and priority features for government users. You know, what that's referring to? ringtone maybe? Automatic ringtone and priority features for government users? I don't know, Elliot, if you could give us some more information or be a little bit more specific, that would help. Anything else? We'll do a last call here for any questions that we weren't able to get to, which I know we've covered quite a bit in the last